concerto is one of the most important forms of music, and concertos have been around since the Baroque period. Bach, one of the most famous composers of all time and a composer from the Baroque period, wrote many concertos, some of which he played himself on the harpsichord, for example. He also wrote concertos for violin. Composers generally have written concertos to feature a solo instrument. In fact, that's what a concerto is. In fact, the word concerto means working in concert or working together. And that working together refers to a soloist working together with an orchestra. So in a concerto, in other words, you have a solo instrument working with an orchestra. In a piano concerto, the piano works with the orchestra. And that means that the piano sometimes plays by itself, sometimes the orchestra plays by itself, and sometimes they play together in a kind of duet. Concertos generally are written to show off the amazing technique and musicality of the solo performer. So they are very, very difficult to play, and it takes many, many hours of practice before you can get to the level of playing a concerto. As I say, concertos have been written from the Baroque period onwards. It was perhaps in the Romantic period that they had their heyday. The Romantic period was a time when audiences generally were bamboozled by the amazing skill of performers like Liszt and Chopin on the piano or Paganini on the violin. These composers and performers would often write concertos and other dazzling pieces for themselves to play, with which they could astound audiences. Often they included a cadenza, which certainly at the time in the Romantic period would be improvised. In other words, it wasn't written down. The cadenza was an opportunity for the composer-performer to show off his or her skill at improvising. Concertos, like symphonies, are large-scale pieces of music. They can last half an hour or more. They tend to be in movements, but unlike a symphony, which normally has 4 movements, a concerto usually has 3. And it's very common for the first movement to be fast, the second movement to be slow, expressive, and then the third movement to be fast again. And that fast, slow, fast pattern has been typical right since the beginning of concerto writing. You will undoubtedly know an awful lot of concertos. Sometimes different parts of the concertos are very famous, and in some cases the whole concerto is extremely well known. Many of them have even been used in the soundtracks to films. Mozart is famous for his piano concertos. He wrote over 20 of them, and he would perform them himself with a small orchestra in the classical period. Like most forms of music, as history wore on, the scale of concertos grew and grew and grew. So composers later on in history didn't write as many as Mozart, for example, but they were on a much grander scale. The piano concertos of Rachmaninoff are very famous, in particular his second piano concerto. That opens with a light piano introduction, and then the orchestra comes in with a big sweeping tune whilst the piano plays some very elaborate arpeggio patterns. And it's a really good example, that opening, of the orchestra and the solo instrument working together to create the music. Other famous examples include the Grieg piano concerto, which was written late in the Romantic period by the Norwegian composer Grieg. There's a very famous violin concerto by a composer called Max Bruch. Going back to the classical period, as well as the many, many piano concertos by Mozart, there are trumpet concertos by Haydn and Hummel, which are very famous. Bach wrote violin concertos, and the list goes on and on. There are many, many of them. I would like you all to listen to some concertos to get a flavour for them. Asking you to listen to the whole of a concerto is a big deal, but perhaps you could listen to the first 4 or 5 minutes of some movements from different concertos from through the ages, just to get a feel for what a concerto is.